Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. So today I'm going to read for you guys the continuation of Five Nights at Freddy's: The Silver Eyes. And again, I'm been a little sick for the past few days. My voice has been weird, so I hope it doesn't affect anything. But I hope you guys enjoy. The door now hung open slightly, but Charlie didn't disturb it. It hadn't opened for her. It had only given way to time. As she moved to stand, she noticed something shiny, halfway hidden under the rim of the locked middle door. She leaned forward to pick it up. It looked like a broken-off piece of circuit board. She smiled slightly. Nuts, bolts, scraps, and parts had turned up all over the place, once upon a time. Her father always had stray parts in his pockets. He would carry around something he was working on, set it down, forget where it was, or worse, put something aside for safekeeping, never to be seen again. There was also a strand of her hair clinging to it. She unwound it carefully from the tiny lip of metal it was stuck on. Finally, as though she had been putting it off, Charlie crossed the room and picked up Theodore. His back had not faded in the sun like the front of his body, and it was the same rich, dark purple she remembered. She pressed the button at the base of his neck, but he remained lifeless. His fur was threadbare, one ear hanging loose by a single rotting thread, and through the hole she could see the green plastic of his circuit board. Charlie held her breath, listening fearfully for something. Lie, the rabbit said with a barely audible halting noise, and Charlie set him down, her face hot and her chest pinched tight. She had not really expected to hear her father's voice again. I love you too. Charlie looked around the room. When she was a child, it had been her own magical world, and she was possessive of it. Only a few chosen friends were ever even allowed inside. She went to her bed and set Stanley moving on his track again. She left, closing the door behind her before the little unicorn came to a halt. She went out the back door to the driveway and stopped in front of the garage that had been her father's workshop. Half buried in the gravel a few feet away was a piece of metal, and Charlie went to pick it up. It was jointed in the middle, and she held it in her hands, smiling a little as she bent it back and forth. An elbow joint, she thought. I wondered who that was going to belong to. She had stood in this exact spot many times before. She closed her eyes, and the memory overwhelmed her. She was a little girl again, sitting on the floor of her father's workshop, playing with scraps of wood and metal as though they were toy blocks, trying to build a tower with the uneven pieces. The shop was hot, and she was sweaty, grime sticking to her legs as she sat in her shorts and sneakers. She could almost smell the sharp, metallic odor of the soldering iron. Her father was nearby, never out of sight, working on Stanley the unicorn. Stanley's face was still unfinished, one side white and shining and friendly, with a gleaming brown eye that seemed almost to see. The other half of the toy's face was all exposed, circuit boards and metal parts. Charlie's father looked at her and smiled, and she smiled back. Beloved. In a darkened corner behind her father, barely visible, hung a jumble of metal limbs. A twisted skeleton with burning silver eyes. Every once in a while, it gave an uncanny twitch. Charlie tried never to look at it, but as her father worked, and she played with her makeshift toys, her eyes were drawn back to it again and again. The limbs, contorted, seemed almost mocking, the thing a ghastly gesture, and yet there was something about it that suggested enormous pain. Daddy? Charlie said, and her father did not look up from his work. Daddy? She said again, more urgently, and this time he turned to her, slowly, as though not fully present to the world. What do you need, sweetie? She pointed at the metal skeleton. Does it hurt? She wanted to ask the question, but when she looked into her father's eyes and found she could not, she shook her head. Nothing. He nodded at her with an absent smile and went back to his work. Behind him, the creature gave another awful twitch, and its eyes still burned. Charlie shivered and drew herself back to the present. She glanced behind her, feeling exposed. She looked down and her gaze fixed on something. 3 widely spaced grooves in the ground. She knelt, thoughtful, and ran her finger over one of them. The gravel was scattered away, the marks worn heavily into the dirt. A camera tripod of some sort? It was the first unfamiliar thing she'd seen. The door to the workshop was cracked open slightly, inviting, but she felt no desire to go inside. Quickly, she headed back to her car. but she stopped as soon as she settled into the driver's seat. Her keys were gone, having probably fallen out of her pocket somewhere inside the house. She retraced her steps, merely glancing into the living room and kitchen before heading up to her bedroom. The keys were on the wicker chair, beside Theodore the rabbit. She picked them up and jangled them for a moment, not quite ready to leave the room behind. She sat down on the bed. Stanley the unicorn had stopped beside the bed as he always did, and as she sat, she patted him absently on the head. It had grown dark while she was outside, and the room was now cast in shadows. Somehow, without the bright sunlight, the toy's flaws and deterioration were thrown into sharp relief. Theodore's eyes no longer shone, and his thin fur and hanging ear made him look like a sickly vagabond. When she looked down at Stanley, the rust around his eyes made them look like hollow sockets, and his barred teeth, which she had always thought of as a smile, became the awful, knowing grin of a skull. Charlie stood up, careful not to touch him, and hurried toward the door, but her foot caught on the wheel beside the bed. She tripped on the tracks and fell sprawling to the floor. There was a whir of spinning metal, and as she raised her head, a small pair of feet appeared under her nose, clad in shining patent leather. She looked up. There above her was Ella, staring down at her, silent and uninvited, her glassy eyes almost appearing to see. The teacup and saucer were held out before her with a military stiffness. Charlie got up cautiously, taking care not to disturb the doll. She left the room, stepping carefully to avoid accidentally activating any other toys. As Charlie went, Ella retreated to her closet, almost matching her pace. Charlie hurried down the stairs, seized by an urgency to get away. In the car, she fumbled the key 3 times before sliding it into place. She backed too fast down the driveway, running recklessly over the grass of the front yard, and sped away. After about a mile, Charlie pulled over on the shoulder and turned the car off, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Her eyes focused on nothing. She forced herself to breathe slowly. She reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror so she could see herself. She always expected to see pain, anger, and sorrow written on her face, but they were never there. Her cheeks were pink, and her round face looked almost cheerful, like always. Her first weeks living with Aunt Jen, she heard the same things over and over when Aunt Jen introduced her. What a pretty child! What a happy-looking child she is! Charlie always looked like she was about to smile, her brown eyes wide and sparkling, her thin mouth ready to curve up, even when she wanted to sob. The incongruity was a mild betrayal. She ran her fingers through her light brown hair as though she would magically fix its slight frizziness and put the mirror back into position. She turned the car back on and searched for a radio station, hoping music might fully bring her back to reality. She flipped from station to station, not really hearing what any of them were playing, and finally settled on an AM broadcast with a host that seemed to be yelling condescendingly at his audience. She had no idea what he was talking about, but the brash and annoying sound was enough to jar her back into the present. The clock in the car was always wrong, so she checked her watch. It was almost time to meet her friends at the dinner they had chosen, near the center of town. Charlie pulled back onto the road and drove, letting the sound of the angry talk radio host soothe her mind. When she reached the restaurant, Charlie pulled into the lot and stopped, but did not park. The front of the diner had a long picture window all across it, and she couldn't see right inside. Though she had not seen them for years, it took her only a moment to spot her friends through the glass. Jessica was easiest to pick out from the crowd. She always enclosed pictures with her letters, and right now she looked exactly like her last photo. Even seated, she was clearly taller than either of the boys, and very thin. Though Charlie couldn't see her whole outfit, she was wearing a loose white shirt with an embroidered vest, and she had a brimmed hat perched on her glossy, shoulder-length brown hair, with an enormous flower threatening to tip it off her head. She was gesturing excitedly about something as she spoke. The 2 boys were sitting next to each other, facing her. Carlton looked like an older version of his red-headed childhood self. He still had a bit of a baby face, but his features had refined, and his hair was carefully tousled and held in place with some alchemical hair product. He was almost pretty, for a boy, and he wore a black workout shirt, though she doubted he'd ever worked out a day in his life. He slouched forward on the table, resting his chin in his hands. Beside him, John sat closest to the window. John had been the kind of child who got dirty before he even went outside. There would be paint on his shirt before the teacher handed out the watercolors, grass stains on his knees before they came near a playground, and dirt under his fingernails after he had just washed his hands. Charlie knew it was him because it had to be, but he looked completely different. The grubbiness of childhood had been replaced by something crisp and clean. He was wearing a neatly pressed, light green button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up and the collar open, preventing him from looking too uptight. He was leaning back confidently in the booth, nodding enthusiastically, apparently absorbed in whatever Jessica was saying. The only concession to his former self was his hair, sticking up all over his head, and he had a 5 o'clock shadow, a smug adult version of the dirt he was always covered in as a kid. Charlie smiled to herself. John had been something like her childhood crush, before either of them really understood what that meant. He gave her cookies from his Transformers lunchbox, and once in kindergarten he took the blame when she broke the glass jar that held colored beads for arts and crafts. She remembered the moment when it slipped from her hands, and she watched it fall. She couldn't have moved fast enough to catch it, but she wouldn't have tried. She wanted to see it break. The glass hit the wood floor and shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the beads scattered, many-colored, among the shards. She thought it was beautiful, and then she started to cry. John had a note sent home to his parents, and when she told him thank you, he had winked at her with an irony behind his ears and simply said, "For what?" After that, John was allowed to come into her room. She let him play with Stanley and Theodore, watching anxiously the first time he learned to press the buttons and make them move. She would be crushed if he didn't like them, knowing instinctively that it would make her think less of him. They were her family, but John was fascinated as soon as he saw them. He loved her mechanical toys, and so she loved him. 2 years later, behind a tree beside her father's workshop, she almost let him kiss her. And then it happened, and everything ended, at least for Charlie. Charlie shook herself, forcing her mind back to the present. Looking again at Jessica's polished appearance, she glanced down at herself. Purple t-shirt, denim jacket, black jeans, and combat boots. It had felt like a good choice this morning, but now she wished she had chosen something else. "This is all you ever wear," she reminded herself. She parked and locked the car behind her, even though people in Hurricane did not usually lock their cars. Then, she went into the diner to meet her friends for the first time in 10 years. The warmth, noise, and light of the restaurant hit her in a wave as she entered. For a moment she was overwhelmed, but Jessica saw her pause in the doorway and shouted her name. Charlie smiled and went over. "Hi," she said awkwardly, flicking her eyes at each of them, but not fully making contact. Jessica scooted over on the red vinyl bench and patted the seat beside her. "Here, sit," she said. She rolled her eyes as she said it, managing to convey both self-deprecation and the sense that her life truly was something exciting. "Did you know Jessica lives in New York?" Carlton said. There was something careful about the way he spoke, like he was thinking about his words before he formed them. John was silent, but he smiled at Charlie anxiously. Jessica rolled her eyes again, and with a flash of déjà vu, Charlie suddenly recalled that this had been a habit even when they were children. 8 million people live in New York, Carlton. It's not exactly an achievement, Jessica said. Carlton shrugged. "I've never been anywhere," he said. "I didn't know you still lived in town," Charlie said. "Where else am I going to live? My family has been here since 1896, he added, deepening his voice to mimic his father. "Is that even true?" Charlie asked. "I don't know," Carlton said in his own register. "Could be. Dad ran for mayor 2 years ago. I mean, he lost, but still, who runs for mayor?" He made a face. "I swear, the day I turn 18, I am out of here." "Where are you gonna go?" John asked, looking seriously at Carlton. Carlton met his eyes, just as serious for a moment. Abruptly, he broke away and pointed out the window, closing one eye as if to get his aim true. John raised an eyebrow as he looked out the window, trying to follow the line Carlton was pointing to. Charlie looked too. Carlton wasn't pointing at anything. John opened his mouth to say something, but Carlton interrupted. "Or," he said as he smoothly pointed in the opposite direction. "Okay." John scratched his head, looking slightly embarrassed. "Anywhere, right?" he added with a laugh. "Where's everyone else?" Charlie asked, peering out the window and searching the parking lot for new arrivals. "Tomorrow," John said. "They're coming tomorrow morning," Jessica jumped in to clarify. "Marla's bringing her little brother. Can you believe it?" "Jason?" Charlie smiled. She remembered Jason as a little bundle of blankets with a tiny red face peeking out. "I mean, who wants a baby around?" Jessica adjusted her hat primly. "Pretty sure he's not a baby anymore," Charlie said. "Practically a baby," Jessica said. "Anyway, I booked us a room at the motel down by the highway. It was all I could find. The boys are staying with Carlton. Okay, Charlie said. She was vaguely impressed by Jessica's organization, but she wasn't happy about the plan. She was loath to share a room with Jessica, who now seemed like a stranger. Jessica had become the kind of girl who intimidated her, polished and immaculate, speaking as though she had everything in life figured out. For a moment, Charlie considered going back to her old house for the night, but as soon as she thought of it, the idea repelled her. That house, at night, was no longer the province of living. Don't be dramatic, she scolded herself, but now John was speaking. He had a way of commanding attention with his voice, probably because he spoke less often than everyone else. He spent most of his time listening, but not out of reticence. He was gathering information, speaking only when he had wisdom or sarcasm to dispense. Often it was both at once. Alright guys, so I am going to leave this here for now. But I hope you guys are enjoying this story so far. Please let me know. This is a pretty long book. I'm not even through the first chapter yet. So yeah, I thought about maybe doing like a live stream and reading live, which I don't know is the best idea for me anyway. But let me know if that's something you guys would be interested in, just to kind of get through more of the book at once. But either way, I'm entirely happy with how it's going now. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I very much appreciate you being here. I always do. I know I always say it, but that's because I really do, and I can't tell you enough. So thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next time.